Hi, my name is Nick. I have an idea for a story. I want to be a writer, and this is where I'll be writing. And this is also where I'm going under quarantine, effectively. So much to talk about, so much to go through, so much has happened. It's been a really busy month. I will explain. This is also where I'm spending my lockdown, because I am living in New Zealand, and on last Wednesday at midnight, New Zealand went into Zone 4, which is our grading system for what happens with COVID-19, and that means that I am staying here and working from home. And there's definitely worse places to work than this. I mean, I'm really glad I worked out my area for working. I'm really glad I sort of sussed it all out. I've had to simplify it a lot because I'm going to be doing 2 jobs from home. I'm teaching using Zoom for my teaching job, and I'm doing my design job from this desk as well. And I'm also trying to write from this desk as well. So lots of activity happening here and there, and so much stuff to talk about. So first and foremost, I don't think the 4-week lockdown is gonna be just 4 weeks. People being people in a capitalist society, in a free market, and in a rather relaxed atmosphere in New Zealand, despite our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern getting us to go lock down fairly early on in the cases and not trying to build herd immunity and all those other kinds of strategies that I'm sure won't actually work. So I'm kind of glad that we haven't gone for that, and we are in lockdown. But it's been pretty scary. So a fortnight ago, things were very, very different. They were looking grim. Coronavirus had reached our shores, which is when I made my last video. But 2 weeks ago, a totally different world, and things are moving so fast. Wow, there's so much to talk about. I just want to apologize that I haven't really made a video this entire month. I saw the end of the month coming up for March, and I realized I really needed to make another one to just so that I'm making one a month, you know, like really wanted to have one for February, and that was a late one, and now it's nearly the end of March, and I wanted to have the one for March. And the good thing is that despite all this, and working from home in the last 3 working days at least, I've actually found some time to write, and so I'm going to try to be precise and succinct to the point, and I want to talk about the normal inhabitants of the planet that is occurring in my book today. So let's go. Well, holy moly. So yeah, I really wanted to make a video for March, and this is it. And this is my response to a crazy month. So just a little bit of backstory. Well, first of all, I'll start from the start. I'm living in this basement part of my house to write this book for a very good reason. One is underused. As you can see from the beginnings of these videos, they're filled with a whole lot of stuff. Baby gear and junk and extra clothes and an organ I was given and all sorts of stuff like that. But I kind of cleared it and moved it around, and basically what me and my partner wanted to do was we wanted to turn it into an art studio here. And as it's turned out, it hasn't really turned into that. It's just turned into a place to do work, and which is fine. And I decided that it was going to be a place where I was gonna sort of like make this book or be creative down here. And then we had our 3rd child, and with our 3rd child, it just made sense for me to actually sleep down here some of the time. And so I'm literally have my bed right next to this desk. So there was a time when I was just getting up and working, and getting up and writing, and getting up and doing stuff. But, you know, being a dad, you know, most of the time it's actually late at night that you're working and you're sort of collapsing into bed after working. So that's usually the way I interact with the space, is that it's the last thing I do, which is apparently like some of the worst writing advice you can give anyone, because you're not really sparky and on top of things and thinking really well about things. So I actually got a lot of writing done actually with my son just strapped to the front of me while he was napping, and I don't know why I get so much work done there. I'm just like literally pressing keys, like single tapping out sentences, but I've actually written quite a bit with him on my front. So that's why I'm down here, and that's why the bed's here. But now, added to that, is that since Wednesday at midnight, because of the numbers of COVID-19 that have come to this country, the COVID-19 cases, I should say, and now there's a lockdown. And so I am working from home. I've got two setups. I've got one set up in the garage for teaching practical art, and here I'm teaching digital art. I'm also doing my other job here, which is as a designer. So I'm trying to juggle a couple of balls, and it's working out okay. And even though I've simplified my space down quite a bit and just tried to make it acceptable for people to phone me or to do Zoom with me here, I've actually just cleared my space a little bit, and I've actually made it a more workable space, believe it or not, and it's actually feeling pretty good for writing. So even though this month has been crazy, because on top of that, my partner's also had surgery for a quite serious surgery. It wasn't supposed to happen then, but as it happened, the only surgeon who could do it had planned to go to Italy, and he phoned us up and said, I've cancelled the trip, or I should say the trip has been cancelled, and we can now perform your partner's surgery. And that was halfway through this month. So I had to take some time off from school. I had to set relief. It's been a whirlwind. And then, as you know, I've been watching COVID-19 since really late January, since the beginning of the school year. Cautiously, optimistically, sometimes pessimistically, but always with a vested interest of wanting to know more about it so I can prepare myself, and hoping against hope that it wouldn't happen and it wouldn't come here, but it did, and it has. And now I'm in lockdown here, and a couple of teachers have emailed me and said, oh, now you have so much more time for writing. Not yet, but as it happens, I've weirdly been able to find some time to work, and I think that's actually been just because I've been inspired by these almost apocalyptic times, these strange occurrences, these bizarre things that are in the news. It feels unreal. And my partner, who hasn't left the house at all for over a week now, maybe 2 weeks, it's really not hitting home for her, the impact. I tried to show her a photo. I tried to take a photo when I went shopping, but I was wearing gloves, and she still doesn't believe me about the lines out the side of the supermarket. Not really. She understands. She's not like she doesn't believe me. It's just that she's finding it hard to believe. So I have basically just a suit that I've arranged of tracksuit pants and a hoodie, gloves, shoes, a hat, and a bandana, and I always wear that when I go out for shopping. And I went for a massive $700 shop. I know you're not supposed to hoard, and I don't believe it's hoarding. It's just that we've got 5 people in our family, and including a baby and someone who's got a compromised immune system because of the diet that she's been on for 6 months. So yeah, I'm going to try to minimize the amount of times I go in and out, which is what everyone says would be a good idea. So I'm not hoarding, I'm just going on big shops. I have to go tomorrow though, which is a bummer. I really don't want to go shopping. It feels like I should be listening to Godspeed You Black Emperor the entire time in the car, just looking around and have a baseball bat and a knife. It feels weird. And what's bizarre is that you'd think I'd have no time to write and I'd just throw it away, but I've actually managed to start a new sort of story arc in this weird time. And with nothing on the wall to inspire me, I didn't need anything like that. I actually started talking to one of my classes about the invention of the internet, and Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and what was happening in 1984, and I started researching this strange year, because it's really the birth of the internet. It's the year that Doom was installed on more PCs than Windows. What else? Waco was coming up. It hadn't happened yet, I don't think. But, oh no, maybe Waco had happened. So many things happened in 1994. So I started talking about the birth of the internet and this sort of project with one of my classes. And I got to thinking about all the things that had happened in that year. So there was O.J. Simpson case, the Doom, of course, ironically named strike. There was a Major League Baseball strike that year, which cancelled a whole lot of games because of their earnings. Lisa Marie Presley married Michael Jackson. Kurt Cobain committed suicide in April. There was the X-Files. There was that deep distrust of the government sort of like percolating around. A lot of people interested in aliens at the time and conspiracy theories. This is all before 9/11, of course, as well. The Tonya Harding thing with Nancy Kerrigan, man, that was I remember that happening. So 1994 was a pretty interesting time and a pretty interesting year. Now I'm 39 this year, so I was 13 in 1994, and I remember, what do I remember? I remember O.J. Simpson, I remember Doom, I remember Michael Jackson marrying Lisa Marie Presley and it being on, I want to say MTV, but we didn't have MTV in New Zealand. I do remember being surprised when someone told me that Nirvana wasn't going to come to New Zealand because Kurt Cobain had killed himself. But at that time, I was just listening incessantly to Nirvana Unplugged in New York. Me and my brother listened to that. Just the spools on our tape machine just were wrecked from listening to that so much. And yeah, quite an interesting year. So I got interested in writing another simulation story that is not really happening in the world of the worship pyramid, but instead hinting at a simulation that that a merge individual is thinking that they are experiencing. And I based their simulation in 1994 on a boy that is getting interested in the burgeoning internet and is a bit of a gamer, likes to play Doom, and he's got ADHD and he's getting tested for it, and he gets some pills, some Ritalin, which was sort of almost experimental at the time. And this was before like every kid in America was bottled up on Ritalin and a whole lot of other drugs. But it was the beginning of that, I might add. And he's sort of makes these Doom wads. I was a bit of a, I don't know, I really got into Doom. I don't know exactly why. I liked other games as well at the time. I never really got into online gaming, but I loved the idea of making a Doom level, which is called a WAD. Unfortunately, I wasn't super good at it, and I just got distracted with music and girls and everything else when you're young. But if I hadn't been distracted by that, I probably would have continued on in that vein. It was something that interested me more than the average kid. Just sort of like tinkering with computers and playing around with files and screwing around with your system. And so I started writing this from the perspective of someone living in Chicago, and I had a vision of a boy biking home on a bicycle that's a bit too small for him, down an avenue, an American avenue, maybe in the sort of the Midwest, outside of Chicago, but definitely sort of Illinois state or somewhere in the Midwest. I don't know exactly where. Maybe even like more north, but around the Great Lakes area. And I was really inspired by the collage work of John Craig, who did a lot of artwork for the Smashing Pumpkins. Actually, not a lot of artwork. He did the artwork for their most successful album, which was Melancholy and Infinite Sadness, which came out in 95. And I definitely remember that album coming out because I remember buying that and just listening to that incessantly. And I still have that CD. I took it to parties and stuff, and it didn't get scratched somehow. It was a really cool album because it just had so many different types of music in it. It wasn't super good for parties, to be honest, because people wanted to listen to Bullet with Butterfly Wings and 1979, and those were on different CDs because it was a double CD, and there was a lot of different there was songs that were just weird and experimental, and then songs that were basically like death metal right next to both of those songs. So it wasn't a super good one to bring to parties, but some people got it, and I had some good relationships based on people's getting that album, and I felt like it was almost a zeitgeist of the time. It was like what Billy Corgan said, that album will be the wall for my generation. But it didn't really have a political stance. It was just still kind of fairy tale, dreamlike, dreamscape sort of stuff. And, you know, being a visual artist now, I have to really hand it to the artists that contribute to how you feel about an album based on the cover art. The cover art does make you feel different about it. Maybe not so much these days, but I collect vinyl, and I have a massive collection of CDs, and you can't help but align a form of music with an image, at least in my generation, because I would get the CD out and I'd put it in. And I had disc wallets and everything else, and I was also part of that generation sort of in the late 90s, early 2000s, when all of our music just went on playlists, and we all started like downloading and Napster and all that kind of stuff, and you got disenfranchised and sort of removed from that cover art. But John Craig's art and a lot of other artwork I started to get into around this month as well is surreal collage, and I really think his contribution to my enjoyment of that album is significant. The woman on the cover is actually a sort of like pre-Raphaelite sort of like woman, but also with the body of Raphael and a beer ads star from the sort of Americana sort of like star ad, and then space as well, which is this big thing as well. And that really inspired me. I started looking up some more surreal artwork. There's actually some really cool artists that I've never been into before. And I started looking at this and getting inspired by that music and listening to... What was I listening to when I was this month? I've been listening to Nirvana Unplugged, Pisces Iscariot by Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana B-Sides, Melvins, what is it? Honey Bucket, Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies, that kind of thing. Just bits and pieces from that time, and it's been a really limited playlist, but I don't know, it just really inspired me. And then somewhere along the line, writing this chapter, I started just not listening to music at all. I started not having anything on the wall, and then then we were hit by the lockdown, and then I was suddenly working from home all of a sudden. So I wanted to keep writing this, and it's just flowing. It's just really flowing now. Unfortunately, it isn't really the plot I should be working on. This is sort of an offshoot. It's a branch to the main plot, but I'm finding it enjoyable. So anyway, the main character is this kid called Jimmy, who is a tall lad, and he's biking home. And this was the vision I had when I wanted to write this chapter. Tall boy on a small bike, driving down at dusk around sort of like November. So Halloween's been, people have still got their jack-o'-lanterns out, riding down this long avenue. There's going to be new houses moved in very soon. It's going to be suburbia soon. It's going to be homogenized soon. But for now, it's old farmhouses and some old American Gothic-like style housing on either side of this avenue. Elm trees. The branches are crackling as he goes down. A truck comes past and it reminds him how late it is. But he stayed at the library mucking around on computers with his friend who is into gaming and is really interested in the internet and giving files to each other and piracy and all that kind of stuff. And his mum, who's his real mum, who's immigrated from Canada, really doesn't trust the internet. And his dad, who's actually secretly a stepdad, is worried about the internet taking his job as well. and so they have an uneasy alliance of him being interested in this, and he's sort of, you know, as teenage boys do, they either secretly take over the home stereo in the 70s and 80s, but I felt, again, in my generation, I think what happened with us is that we just slowly sort of like took over the house computer. So all of my friends would always be mucking around on the house computer until at which point it became actually socially acceptable for us to get our own computer, which happened, but for a while there in the mid-90s, it was perfectly acceptable to just sort of like put your pirated copies of Doom and your weird little files and your things that you were sharing with your friend all on the family computer. Just like, it's fine. My dad doesn't really use it for his job, and my mum doesn't care. She just uses it to play solitaire. So that's what we did, all of us. And so maybe the reason I'm finding it so easy to write this chapter is because a lot of it is based on personal experience. I didn't live in America, but I felt like my childhood was very influenced by American culture. I had a lot of American friends. Some people thought I spoke with an American accent. Some people still think I do for whatever reason. It's probably watching too much American television. Or something wrong with my mouth. And I was influenced by the same sort of interests. I listened to American music. I don't know why. I was never really... and when Britpop happened, I don't know, where was I? I don't know. I was always more interested in American music for whatever reason. And never really got into Kiwi music until much later. I really like Split Enz now, and I can look at it sort of afresh, but during my childhood I was just infatuated with American music. There was just so much of it, and it was easy to delve into. I liked that world. Which brings me back to like sort of the art of John Craig. So I started looking at a lot of this art, and I had as my screensaver on this laptop, which I've found really useful to have a different computer to write on. So I have one computer to do work and one computer to do writing, which has been a massive help to sort of like separate. And wow, it's just so easy to write when you don't really care. It's not a super duper important plot. I don't know if it's all... It could all be a way to procrastinate away from the main plot, because my main plot remains about this character called Malachi and Awen, who are gods of Eden. But I feel like I need to talk about, before I start talking about the gods of Eden, I need to talk about the people of Eden. And Eden is... Right, this is what I want to talk about in this video. Eden is the earth. It's the modern word for earth, the modern terminology for planet Earth. And on Eden lives Edenites. Edenites are the main population, and they worship the gods of Eden above them. But so too do the Guildborg, who work and produce the goods and services of Earth. So what do the Edenites do, though? So the Guildborg are not purely robotic beings, for they have a real brain, real heart, real lungs. But the rest of them is plasteel, plastic, and porcelain. Very weak, delicate creatures that live possibly on Mars, but somewhere very, very far away from the main cities. In the main cities where the Edenites live, there's only two cities, which are called systems. And the systems are Sarhane and Messo. I forget what I got Sarhane from, but Messo is sort of a hint of Mesopotamia. And I kind of wanted an East Coast, West Coast sort of concept, like New York, Los Angeles, or even Old World, like Europe, New World, America. Sort of associations with that. So Sarhane is where the original engines that made the consciousnesses of the Orb Abyss really started, and Messo is sort of where things are happening now. There's a lot more business there. There's a lot more freedom of rights for people. It's a little bit less traditional. It's more forward-thinking, less conservative. and more money obsessed as well, or credit obsessed in Messo. So that's kind of, I don't know if it's a sort of a New York, Los Angeles thing or a Europe, America thing. I've got a twist though with those cities, but most of the people that live in these two cities that worship the gods of Eden are these people called Edenites, and they fall into races, and I developed 9 races, and this was sort of a thing. Again, I don't really think it's procrastinating. I kind of joke it's procrastinating, but I'm sure it's not. It's just world building. So there's 9 different races of Eden. They're all related to what's called a congregation for a god of Eden. So a congregation is a large group of people that are filled with advisors to the god themselves, of how they project themselves, how they show themselves to their fan, what they say, not their posts, but the equivalent of that is their proclamations. And these proclamations go out to everywhere. And remember, the gods are constantly recorded with teeny tiny little cameras called cherubs, so they cannot get away. None of their life is private. So what are these 9? So I will start with number 1. Number 1 are librarians. I know this is a weird one to start off with, but librarians are in fact an almost extinct race of human beings. I should add, all of these races are genetically modified to best suit their purpose. None of these job descriptions are completely strict anymore, because there has been a revolution called the Revolution of the South, just prior to when my book is based. So people are lessening these traditional values about that if you're this, you need to do this. So it brings me just to something really important. I've just been reading Roots. I am almost finished the book now, and it has been an absolutely fascinating read. I thought it was going to take me all the way until the 1970s, but I'm nearly finished now. It's still in the 1860s. It's 6 generations of African Americans coming from slave ships and being enslaved and living through the Constitution and the Atlantic slave trade and the plantations. And now in the 1860s, the main character now, but it keeps changing. It started with Kunta Kinte, and then it went to his daughter Kizzy, and then her son called Chicken George, and now his son is called Tom, and Tom is a blacksmith. And what's happening right now is that it's about to enter the Civil War, which is one of the most deadly times in history for a human to live, and it looks like the North is going to lose. But the reason why it's been such a good inspiration to be reading that book while I've been world building is that it's really fascinating to look back at history and think about different races doing different jobs, and how, and of course this is incredibly racist, but this is, looking back at history, people were pushed into particular types of occupation based on where they were from and everything else. I mean, the English did it with the Irish, they did it with the Americans, did it with the African Americans that they made into slaves, and also all of Latin America, which actually took the bulk of the Atlantic slave trade. The class system, the caste system in India, it's fascinatingly outdated, and also strangely it's strangely fascinating, but it's also incredibly racist. But it got me thinking about different types of races doing different particular jobs. And like I said in my last video, I want to set my book in an interesting time when times are changing, not when things are static, but when things are starting to fall down or be questioned. And one of those things that have happened but doesn't go into detail in the book, well, there's 2 things that are hinted at in the book. One is called the Silent Wars, and no one knows exactly what that is, but it's sort of used as a blanket statement to explain why there's 2 systems, and all those two systems need to be different, and there's transport between them. There's also the Ark project, and all of the animals that are nearly extinct have been released into the wild and exist in the wild between these 2 systems, which are basically massive, massive cities, or almost countries, I suppose. And the ARC project is just genetically modifying or genetically rescuing animals from extinction. But the other big event that is hinted at throughout the book is the Revolution of the South. And the Revolution of the South is when the concept that if you were one particular race of humanity, you needed to do a particular job inside a god's congregation, that has now those ideas have broken down and don't exist that much. So those traditions are starting to be questioned. And so inside the congregation of the main characters of our god characters, they are starting to use different races for different jobs. Of course, the traditions still hold, but it's starting to break down. And that's when I think an interesting time for sci-fi to be set is in. So there's nine races of humanity in my book. So number one, which is a weird place to start, are the Librarians. And Librarians are now defunct and nearly extinct themselves. There's hardly any of them that exist. But they do happen in chapter 1 of this book, when Malachi has a librarian send a message to him and wants to meet him. And of course, Malachi, being the patron god of mystery and intrigue, wants to meet this dwarf and see the artifacts he has from the time before the Silent Wars. And he's got maps and some old books and some other very physical, non-digital elements that he really wants to see and think about. And he just loves antiques. So a librarian is the reason why the librarians are basically defunct and extinct, is that there's no need for them anymore. So all data has been stored up in the orb. The six consciousness have constructed the mechanics to hold on to everyone's debt using the abyss, and they've constructed the orb, which is sort of the donut torus shaped cloud of data. So there's no need for librarians whose job in the world was to maintain the data and to look after the artifacts of humanity. And there were small little dwarves who had very, very pale skin with violet eyes and bright red hair, because they didn't really see the sun very much, and they maintained this and looked after this. But of course, they're not needed anymore since this has happened. Number 2 are the aestheticians. I don't know quite how to say it, but in terms of speaking, it's aesthetic. Some people say aesthetic, which I don't understand. Your aesthetic characteristics. So the aestheticians are almost like advisors of how people should act, express, how they should perform their spirit as a god, how they should express their personality to their followers, how they should act, and when they do proclamations, what they should wear, what they should do for their surgery. So it's just, I mean, everything in my book is sort of like a straw man or a substitute for what I'm trying to comment on in terms of modern day obsession with celebrityhood. So, of course, the aesthetician is basically like the head advisory committee who wants to be in complete control of the image of their client. And I know this happens today with the Kardashians and massive A-grade celebrities, but the aestheticians sort of take it one step further. These people have bright red eyes, and super bright red lips. Almost, I mean, I know it was a terrible movie, but Dune, George Lynch's Dune, I loved it. I got the pop-up book when I was a kid. I got the pop-up book before I even saw the movie. That movie's cool. It's really, really bad. It's so bad it's good. I mean, it's a good book, but like I said I think I said in my second video that I'm not a big, massive fan of like the writing of Dune, but something about Lynch's vision, it does work in places. There's a couple of moments that are gold. Anyway, so it just reminded me of House Harkonnen a little bit, I guess. Anyway, so the aestheticians are sort of always the head of the house, of the congregation that advises the god about how to carry themselves and express themselves and everything else. Red eyes, red lips, super intense. But that is now a tradition that's starting to fall apart. The third race of humanity are the farmers. Farmers with a PH. Farmers. And the farmers are ones who are in charge of the pharmaceutical reliance on congregations, and they use particular types of pills, and using what's called communion, they force or coerce members of the congregation to continue to take their pills so they stay in love, just totally devoted to their god. So I don't know if this is a big commentary on Big Pharma or not. I'm not sure if I can be bothered doing that, but it's a deliberate sort of like PH farmers. I wanted to base the farmers sort of on the Aiku people of Japan, which seem like stocky, almost Russian, Japanese kind of looking people. Yeah, the fourth type of human, or the fourth race of humanity, are the alchemists. And the alchemists, I want to look basically sort of a combination of Asian and African sort of features. And the alchemists are those that find the precious metals in the ground and who are miners, but also sort of use those alloys to create conduits and superconductors and all these other amazing things of the modern age. Nowadays they're less in that particular game because the Sin have taken those jobs. As to the fifth type, which are called the Silicon Smiths. And the Silicon Smiths originally created the Sin, but now the Sin, which is artificial intelligence, are now making themselves. So that means there's less and less Silicon Smiths, although they can repair and they emphatically understand. I wanted to make the Silicon Smiths super, super pale, like almost like white skin, white eyes, white hair, and they emphatically, inherently understand the programming of artificial intelligence and the componentry and electronic sort of interface with robotics. But again, they are more and more less important in that particular role, and times are changing as well. Scriveners are basically, what they want them to look like is basically Nubian looking people with bright yellow eyes, and they are in charge of, it's sort of similar to this aestheticians, but they are in charge of the poetic elements of the congregation. So they're basically the super self-aware observers of culture, and kind of the equivalent, I suppose, of people that almost have a job of screening through Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds and sort of like suggesting things to people. So they're basically watchers of the social world and what gods are doing. And while the aestheticians are very visually trained from birth, have a genetic disposition to be super visually aware, the scriveners are more aware of how things will be interpreted by others, and almost work like a bank, a financial advisor, except it's more like a societal advisor. The HARUSPEX are more of a religious sect or race, and I wanted them to look kind of sort of Indian, but with white or blonde hair and totally blind, all of them. And they are basically like modern day witches or medicine men. They're basically divination and communication, and have communication with the entities, the 6 entities, so they can communicate and discuss and interpret what is meant by the gods. And when I say the gods of the gods, I mean the 6 entities. So they they look for omens and interpret meanings within it. So while there's not a congregation isn't going to be filled with HARUSPEX, they always have one, but they're very mysterious, and they somehow manage to stay integral in this changing time. And the last race is the fate merchants, and the fate merchants are basically like the bankers. They're possibly the most common, and they don't necessarily fit within the congregation of gods, and they are more intermingled, and they're not a super interbred race. They can operate outside of the congregation and form the bulk of humanity that interacts now increasingly with more and more sin that are entering the workforce. And fate merchants have an implicit understanding of the stock market, and really good ones are almost like have almost a divination sort of understanding of the mystery of the rise and fall of the markets. And one of my main characters is going to be a fate merchant who is having an identity crisis. And I've written that one. Actually, I wrote that one in Nelson the last time I went to Nelson. So that is a whole main character. That's another plot off Malachi and A1. I'm getting worried I've got too many plots that's sort of going off the main one, but that's the way I want to write, and it keeps me writing. So instead of getting frustrated and writing and not writing anything, I'm just going to see what happens. I'm just going to write. It's all in the related universe, so it doesn't really matter. I'm making pages. Just realized I forgot to mention a really important race called the Shepherds, and the Shepherds maintain and look after the merge. That is a really important race. I am really embarrassed I forgot to mention that. So the Shepherds actually form an integral part of the plot line in all of the chapters about simulations, because the Shepherds can enter those simulations as well of the merge that think they're living that life, and make sure that their life has an element of drama to it, otherwise they're not able to assist with teleportation. So they have to feel these emotions so that the Orbibus can function, and that the process of teleportation can actually occur. Oh yeah, sorry, that's only 8. The very, very last race is called the Atomic Priesthood, and this is a really important one. The Atomic Priesthood, I want them to look sort of, I don't know, I guess Southeast Asian, but with really, really pale blue eyes. And the Atomic Priesthood are a really important race, and they hold the keys and the codes for our nuclear weapons. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but this guy called Thomas Sebiuk came up with this idea of the Atomic Priesthood as an idea so that people would be aware of the importance of not going into highly radioactive areas in the future. And that's basically because the dangers we face in the future of having atomic fallout and radioactive material is that signs and words might not be communicated all that long and be useful for all that long, whereas the actual dangerous material will outlast those signs and those semiotics. So the idea by Thomas Sebiuk was that an atomic priesthood would be established, and they would exist as a religious sect that would hold on to these traditions about where not to go, where there is nuclear waste, nuclear fallout, or atomic weaponry. And that's because religion and cultural traditions outlive a lot of rules and regulations and signs and areas. And that's really a cornerstone for my book, was the Atomic Priesthood. It's not an original idea because it's been used in other sci-fi books, but I really want to have the Atomic Priesthood as a race represented. Because, you know, if you had thousands of years in the future a fascinatingly cautious area, or an area that is filled with keep out signs and fences or something architecturally hostile, it would actually encourage people to check out what was there. Like it was almost like a temple where you're trying to hide something that's worth something. So if you think of people like explorers like Indiana Jones going to a place that's very hostile and wants to get rid of you and wants to squash you with a big giant ball, it's because it's trying to protect its treasure. But what if that thing that the whole temple is based on is actually just trying to keep you safe away from something that's just bad for humanity and as a half-life of 10,000 years, and that has existed far longer than the culture that made it. So that was the idea of the atomic priesthood, and the atomic priesthood is a really interesting story arc that I want to play with soon, but all that I've written about it so far is a teeny tiny bit of a chapter when Malachi visits Awen and finds out that she has an atomic priesthood as one of her advisors in her congregation, and he thinks that's really unusual and thinks that despite the fact that she's from Sarhain and she's quite traditional in other ways, and he thinks that she's quite liberal for not being super traditional about having particular races doing their particular job that they've been genetically modified and created for. So that's what I wanted to talk about, the 9 races. I am more than aware that a sort of a numbers thing is starting to occur in my book. 3, 6, and 9, and also 16 and 19 and 13 are starting to reappear, and I'm just letting it happen now, and I think if it's anything to go on, I think I'll just keep it, but I'll see what happens. I'm quite liking that this is also sort of reminds me of a pyramid for some reason, even though a pyramid sort of has 4 surfaces, or 5 surfaces, depending on what kind of pyramid it is, but let's not worry about that. 5 is not a good number for my book, but 6 is a good one. I've decided that the little altars that the merge sit around and have their little simulations around to make things appear for the congregations of the gods are going to be in 3s and 6 and 9s, and sometimes 13, 16 and 19 as well. But I don't know what to call them other than altars, but really they're kind of like portals. But I'll play around with that now later. Right now I'm really enjoying writing this little chapter, which is a branch off my main plot, which is a simulation of a merge called Jimmy, who thinks he's living in 1994. And I'm every now and again I'm going back to my old plot and just seeing what I've got, and I'm taking my time, but I'm enjoying myself. So it's working out quite well, and despite the lockdown, or maybe because of the lockdown that I'm currently in, this is actually conducive for me to just continue writing. I'm not spending any time moving around and transporting, so I'm finding it really useful, and hopefully I can get some more work done and return to my main plot. But for my main plot, I still need to do some more world building before I get into anything else. So my next video is going to be about the gods of Eden, which is going to be a little bit more interesting, I hope, because that's really the main characters are gods, apart from 981, who's a Guildborg. So I'm really finding it useful to talk about my book and who's in the book and the world that my characters inhabit. But at the same time I'm writing. I'm not just using it as an excuse to not write because I don't know exactly what's happening in the world. I'm kind of figuring it out as I go. It's all very organic. It's going in and out. I'm rewriting stuff. But yeah, it's going well. So I'll see you next time when I start talking about the gods.